If you are trying to make sense of the breakup recovery timeline, you are probably living in a strange place right now where some days feel almost manageable, and then something knocks you flat again without warning, and you cannot figure out why the progress keeps disappearing on you. Here is what the science actually shows. The breakup recovery timeline is not a straight line from pain to fine. It moves in phases, each one doing different neurological work inside your brain and body, each one with its own rhythm and its own demands. Understanding those phases does not make the pain go away, but it does something almost as valuable. It makes the confusion go away. And once you understand where you are in the process, you can work with what is happening instead of fighting it or wondering if something is wrong with you. Most people enter a breakup expecting recovery to feel like a gentle downward slope from intense pain toward calm, as though each week should register a little better than the last. But research consistently shows that recovery from relational loss does not work that way. Ruth Davis Konigsberg's review of grief science found that people cycle through emotional states rather than march through them in neat stages, which means you will have difficult days scattered among better ones with no clean boundary between them. The waves do not mean you are failing or going backward. They mean your nervous system is doing the complicated work of adapting to a profound change in how your daily world is organized, and that adaptation follows its own biological pace rather than a calendar. Knowing that the waves are expected and that they do not erase the progress underneath them changes what it means to have a bad day. The first phase of the breakup recovery timeline is what researchers call the acute stress phase, and it typically covers the first 3 weeks or so after the relationship ends. Bruce McEwen's work on allostasis at Rockefeller University showed that this initial period involves cortisol levels elevated up to 40% above your normal baseline. That is not a sign of weakness or of overreacting. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, and when something this significant happens, your body releases it because your nervous system is treating the loss the same way it would treat a physical threat to your survival. Your sleep gets disrupted, your appetite changes, your thoughts loop in circles, your chest feels tight or heavy. These are not just emotional experiences. They are physiological events happening inside a body that has just received the signal that something has gone seriously wrong and that every system needs to respond to it urgently. What makes the acute phase particularly disorienting is that your brain is doing something specific during this time. It is holding the attachment system in a state of high alert, actively searching for ways to restore the connection that was lost. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research at Northeastern University on predictive brain function shows that your mind has been running a prediction model that included this person in your daily life. And now that model is failing constantly because the person keeps not being there in the ways it expects. The hypervigilance you feel, the compulsive checking of your phone, the replaying of old conversations, the urge to reach out even when you know you should not. These are all the nervous system's attempts to solve what it perceives as an unresolved survival problem. It is not irrational. It is actually quite logical from the perspective of a brain that has not yet fully accepted that the relationship is permanently gone and that the old prediction model needs to be updated. The second major phase is attachment deactivation, and it generally begins between 3 weeks and about 3 months into recovery. Philip Shaver's attachment research at the University of California, Davis documented what happens as the attachment system gradually learns that its usual signals are no longer producing results. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to motivation and reward seeking, begins to disconnect from the mental representation of your ex as those pathways stop being reinforced by actual contact. The craving tends to decrease by roughly 30% each month once consistent absence is maintained, but the key word is consistent. The brain is learning through what researchers call extinction learning, a process where a conditioned response fades because it is no longer being reinforced. And extinction requires a clear, repeated signal that a particular behavior no longer produces a reward. Each time contact breaks, the extinction process restarts. During the attachment deactivation phase, the pull to break no contact does not feel like weakness or sentimentality. It often feels logical, almost urgent, as if something genuinely important is at stake and you need to act on it. Joseph Ledoux's fear conditioning research at New York University helps explain why. The same neural circuits involved in threat detection are also involved in the drive to restore attachment bonds, so reaching out during this phase does not just feel emotionally tempting. It actually reactivates the threat detection loop and resets the extinction learning process from the beginning. Every contact, even brief, even calm and friendly, teaches your nervous system that the attachment behavior still has a chance of producing a result. The absence itself is the learning signal your brain needs. This is not about punishment or control. It is simply the mechanism by which the nervous system lets go. There is actually a quiet, beautiful game called Inner Phoenix built around navigating exactly these kinds of emotional phases. A 3D sanctuary where you can process what you are feeling and what you need at each stage of recovery, but more on that in a moment. Let's keep going. Somewhere around 3 to 6 months in, most people begin to notice the third phase, neural reorganization. Richard Davidson's effective neuroscience research at the University of Wisconsin showed that during this period, the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational thought and emotional regulation, begins to regain regulatory control over the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm center. The memories of the relationship do not disappear during this phase, but they become less acutely painful. You can think about your ex without the same level of physiological alarm flooding your chest. You might notice that you can have a whole afternoon without the thought intruding, or that when it does arrive, it carries less weight than it did before. This shift in how the brain processes those memories is one of the clearest measurable signs that reorganization is underway, and it is happening below your conscious awareness even on days when you cannot feel it. One of the things that shifts during neural reorganization is how memory itself functions in relation to the relationship. James McGaw's research at UC Irvine on emotional memory consolidation showed that memories formed during periods of high emotional arousal are stored more intensely than ordinary memories, which is why breakup-related memories can feel so vivid and intrusive in the early weeks. But the brain has a process called reconsolidation, where each time a memory is retrieved, it briefly becomes somewhat malleable before being stored again. During neural reorganization, when the level of emotional arousal has lowered, this reconsolidation process gives the brain a chance to re-encode the memory with less emotional charge attached to it. This is why the same memory that once made you cry immediately might, a few months later, feel more like something that happened rather than something still happening to you right now. That shift is not forgetting. It is the brain doing exactly what it is supposed to do. The fourth phase, which researchers generally place between 6 and 12 months for significant long-term relationships, is identity reconstruction. Dan McAdams' narrative psychology research at Northwestern University documented how people build what he calls personal myths, the internal narratives through which they understand who they are. A serious relationship becomes deeply woven into that personal myth. When it ends, part of the narrative scaffolding comes down with it, and the brain has to construct new neural networks representing who you are now, independent of that partnership. This is not simply getting over someone. It is the neurological work of building a coherent self-concept that does not center around the relationship you no longer have. That construction takes time and real-world input from new experiences. It cannot happen by thinking your way through it alone. The narrative you construct about this experience matters more than most people realize. McAdams' research found that people who tell what he calls redemptive narratives, stories that move from difficulty toward meaning or growth, show significantly better long-term well-being outcomes than people who tell contamination narratives, where the bad thing permanently ruined something good. This does not mean forcing positivity onto pain. It means allowing the story you tell about this chapter to eventually include what came after the loss, not only what was lost. If this video is helping you make sense of something that has felt confusing, it would mean a lot if you gave it a like or passed it on to someone who might need it right now. It helps these conversations reach people who are searching for this kind of explanation in some of their harder moments, and that is exactly why this channel exists. Recovery timelines vary between individuals far more than most people expect. Susan Nolan-Hoeksema's rumination research at Yale University identified several factors that significantly shape recovery pace and attachment intensity, meaning how deeply enmeshed your sense of self was with this particular person, turns out to matter more than relationship duration. Duration matters, but it is a less powerful predictor than you might assume. What predicts slower recovery more consistently is a combination of anxious attachment style, limited social support, and a habitual tendency toward rumination. Studies show roughly a 25% difference in recovery pace between people at the high and low ends of these variables, which is substantial understanding. Which of these factors are active in your own experience is one of the most practically useful things you can do, because each one can be worked with deliberately. One of the most painful parts of navigating a breakup recovery timeline is the comparison trap. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory showed that people automatically calibrate their own experience against their perception of how others are doing. And nowhere does this cause more damage than in grief and loss. When someone you know appears to have recovered faster than you, your brain tends to interpret that as data about your own worth or adequacy, rather than as a reflection of the enormous individual variability in recovery pathways. What you are usually not seeing is whether that person actually processed what happened, or whether they are running avoidance strategies that simply delay the phases without completing them. Avoidance does not skip the work. It defers it, and deferred grief tends to surface later in forms that are harder to recognize as grief. In the acute stress phase, the most useful thing you can do is prioritize physiological support rather than trying to accelerate grief resolution. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory research at the University of North Carolina showed that the nervous system has a hierarchy of functional states, and when cortisol is as elevated as it is in the early weeks, the system needs gentle downregulation before deeper emotional processing becomes possible. Sleep sits at the top of this hierarchy. Matthew Walker's sleep research at UC Berkeley established that emotional memory processing happens primarily during REM sleep. So disrupted, sleep does not just make you feel worse. It also disrupts the brain's primary repair mechanism for emotional distress. Supporting sleep even imperfectly through consistent sleep and wake times, reduced evening screen light, and simple relaxation practices before bed is one of the highest leverage actions available to you in the earliest weeks of recovery. Physical movement is the second major physiological lever available in the acute phase, and it works through several different mechanisms simultaneously. Wendy Suzuki's research at New York University on exercise and the brain showed that aerobic activity increases BNAF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports neural plasticity and emotional resilience. Movement also temporarily lowers cortisol and raises serotonin. Research from the University of Vermont found that even 30 minutes of mild to moderate walking produced significant mood improvements lasting up to 12 hours in people experiencing emotional distress. You do not need intense or sustained exercise for these effects to occur. The movement does not need to feel meaningful or transformative in the moment. The biochemical changes it triggers are real even when the emotional relief feels minimal or absent. During the neural reorganization phase, cognitive restructuring becomes one of the most evidence-supported tools for actively supporting recovery. Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy research at the University of Pennsylvania showed that automatic thoughts, the ones that arise without deliberate effort, shape emotional experience more powerfully than the events that trigger them. After a breakup, automatic thoughts often take distorted forms. I will never be loved like that again. I was not enough. This proves there is something fundamentally wrong with me. Identifying these thoughts and deliberately evaluating their accuracy, not to dismiss the pain underneath them, but to challenge the catastrophized interpretation of it, has been shown in multiple randomized controlled trials to reduce depressive symptoms and accelerate emotional recovery. You do not have to believe the more balanced thought immediately. You only have to introduce it as a possibility worth considering. Rumination, the habit of repetitively focusing on distress and its causes without reaching any new understanding or resolution, is one of the most significant factors that extends recovery beyond its natural course. Susan Nolan-Hoeksema's research demonstrated that ruminators take significantly longer to recover from loss, even when their initial level of distress was identical to people who did not ruminate. The problem is not thinking about the breakup. Reflection and emotional processing are healthy and necessary parts of recovery. The problem arises when the thinking becomes circular, always returning to the same unanswerable questions. The why did this happen, and what if I had done things differently, loops that never arrive anywhere new. Ed Watkins's research at the University of Exeter showed that abstract ruminative processing can be disrupted by shifting toward concrete, specific, present moment thinking. Not, why am I still not over this? But what is happening in my body right now, and what is one specific small thing I could do in the next 10 minutes? We would love to hear from you in the comments. What has been the most useful thing you have found for quieting the looping thoughts? Your answer genuinely helps other people watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, turning on notifications means you will be here for all of these conversations as they continue. The identity reconstruction phase responds most directly to new experiences, particularly ones that build what researchers call self-complexity. Patricia Linville's research at Yale showed that people with a more diverse range of self-defining activities, relationships, skills, and interests are significantly more resilient after major loss because their sense of self is not concentrated in the one area that was damaged. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow research at Claremont Graduate University found that engaging in novel activities that absorb your attention, ones that require enough focus to interrupt the default mode network's tendency to loop through painful memories, is one of the most reliable ways to give the brain new material for building identity beyond the relationship. You do not have to love the new thing immediately, and you do not have to feel motivated before you start. The motivation tends to follow the engagement, not the other way around. Somatic and expressive practices deserve attention as a complement to cognitive approaches, because the body holds stress responses that the mind may have only partially processed. James Pennebaker's expressive writing research at the University of Texas showed that writing about your deepest thoughts and feelings related to a difficult experience for as little as 15 to 20 minutes over 3 to 4 consecutive days produced measurable improvements in immune function, mood, and long-term psychological adjustment. The mechanism is not simply venting or catharsis. It is the narrative construction that happens during writing, the same prefrontal amygdala integration that occurs in natural recovery, but deliberately activated. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work also showed that gentle body-based practices, including diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and mindful movement, help complete the physiological stress cycles that remain active in the body long after the mind has begun processing the loss cognitively. Tracking your own recovery by markers rather than by time is more accurate and more useful than counting days. Ed Danner's subjective well-being research at the University of Illinois identified 3 core components of well-being: positive affect, negative affect, and life satisfaction. After a breakup, watching these 3 dimensions rather than watching the calendar gives a much more honest picture of where you are. You might notice that positive moments are becoming slightly longer or more frequent. You might notice that rumination episodes are spaced slightly farther apart than they were last month. You might notice that your sleep quality or appetite has gradually improved. These microsignals are meaningful data. They are evidence of the biological work happening underneath the surface, even on days when you cannot feel it happening. Measuring recovery by markers rather than by months changes the entire experience of going through it, because progress stops being invisible. Social connection quality accelerates all phases of the breakup recovery timeline. John Cacioppo's loneliness research at the University of Chicago showed that perceived social connection directly affects cortisol regulation, immune function, and the rate of neural plasticity. What matters is not the quantity of social contact, but the felt sense of being genuinely heard and not alone. A single conversation with someone who listens without trying to fix things or rush you toward resolution is neurologically more beneficial than hours of surface-level interaction. Cacioppo's work found that quality social support can reduce recovery time by 20 to 30% across all phases. If people around you are trying to snap you out of it or suggesting you should already be over this by now, that pressure is worth noticing. Your nervous system needs to feel safe in order to do this work, and pressure tends to activate the threat response rather than the rest and repair system. Professional support can make a measurable difference at any phase of the timeline, and it becomes particularly valuable during identity reconstruction, when the work of rebuilding the self is complex enough to benefit from a guided process. Research reviewed by the American Psychological Association consistently supports the finding that therapy targeting breakup-specific concerns, including attachment disruption, self-concept reconstruction, and grief processing, can reduce recovery duration by roughly 30% compared to unsupported recovery. The most studied approaches include cognitive behavioral therapy for distorted thinking patterns, EMDR for processing experiences that have a traumatic quality, and acceptance and commitment therapy for building psychological flexibility around difficult emotions. If the relationship was long, intense, or involved betrayal, abuse, or sudden loss, professional support is not an indulgence. It is a practical intervention with documented outcomes, and using it does not mean you are incapable of handling this. It means you are handling it well. Setbacks are a built-in feature of the breakup recovery timeline. not a sign that you are doing it wrong or that the progress has been erased. Joseph Ledoux's research on fear conditioning at New York University showed that even after extinction learning appears complete, unexpected stressors, context cues, or sensory reminders can temporarily reactivate the conditioned response. Neuroscientists call this spontaneous recovery. The setback you experience after a period of feeling better is not evidence that you are back at square one. The extinction learning is still there. The setback is a temporary reactivation, and it does not undo the work that was done. Understanding this matters because the most dangerous part of a setback is often the story you tell about it. This means I'll never get through this, or I've been fooling myself about my progress. That story, if believed, creates the kind of despair that actually does slow recovery down. Self-compassion is one of the most practically useful frameworks for navigating the breakup recovery timeline without adding unnecessary suffering to the necessary kind. Kristen Neff's research at the University of Texas showed that self-compassion has three components: treating yourself with kindness rather than judgment, recognizing that difficulty and suffering are part of shared human experience rather than evidence of personal deficiency, and holding your painful feelings with mindful awareness rather than over-identification with them. When you are frustrated with how long recovery is taking, self-compassion is what allows you to respond to that frustration the way you might respond to a close friend going through the same thing, with patience rather than pressure. Research consistently shows that self-compassion predicts better recovery outcomes, not because it makes pain disappear faster, but because it removes the secondary layer of suffering that comes from judging yourself for not being over it yet. And that secondary layer is often heavier than the original pain itself. The research on post-traumatic growth offers a longer view of what the breakup recovery timeline can ultimately produce for people who move through it rather than around it. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte spent decades documenting how people who engage with significant adversity rather than avoiding it frequently report growth across 5 domains: a stronger sense of personal strength, new possibilities they had not previously considered, deeper reality, on ships, a greater appreciation for life, and a shift in their existential or spiritual understanding. This growth is not inevitable, and it does not happen passively by simply waiting long enough. It requires some willingness to stay with the discomfort of the experience and allow it to teach something rather than just survive it. But the evidence that this kind of deepening is genuinely possible, not as a platitude, but as a documented psychological outcome, is worth holding on to when you are in the early phases and cannot see past the pain. Your nervous system is doing something genuinely remarkable right now, even if it does not feel that way from the inside. Jaak Panksepp's effective neuroscience work at Washington State University established that the systems responsible for social bonding and the grief of losing an attachment figure share deep roots with the biological systems that process physical pain. Losing someone important registers in the brain as a real injury, not a metaphorical one. And just as a physical injury heals through predictable biological stages from inflammation through repair to remodeling, the nervous system heals from relational loss through its own predictable sequence of phases. The reason you are not over this yet, whatever phase you are in, is not that you are weak or that something is wrong with you. It is that healing is a biological process with a biological pace, and that process is already underway inside you right now, whether or not you can feel it moving. Understanding the breakup recovery timeline will not make the journey shorter, but it will make it less confusing, less lonely, and far less likely to be derailed by the false belief that you are doing something wrong. Carol Dweck's mindset research at Stanford University showed that understanding the mechanisms behind a difficult experience shifts your relationship to it in ways that measurably reduce suffering and improve outcomes. When you know what phase you are in, you can ask the right question. Not, why am I not better yet? But what does this phase actually need from me right now? That is a completely different question, and it opens completely different possibilities. If this video helped you understand something about where you are, we would love for you to share it with someone else who might be in the same place. Subscribing and turning on the notification bell means you will be here for these conversations as they continue, and every one of them is built around the same idea: that understanding what is happening inside you is one of the most compassionate and practical things you can offer yourself. And before you go, there is a 3D game called Inner Phoenix. You walk through it like a quiet sanctuary with rooms for what you are observing about your recovery phase, what you are feeling right now, what you need in this particular stage, and what you might try next. You can scan the QR code at the end of the video to visit, or find it linked in the description below at innerphoenix.app. It was made for exactly these moments when you understand that healing is happening, but you want something to walk alongside you while it does. No pressure. It is there whenever you feel ready.